What's not to love about Dracula? Come on, he's immortal. He shapeshifts. He is known all around the world. He's inspired so many stories.
The darkness appeals to me. The solemnity appeals to me. The sensuality. Vampires are very sensual creatures to me. And then the idea that you can live forever and never change. You stay the way you are when you're transformed and transition. And live forever and watch history unfold. That intrigues me. I know you keep losing people to normal death, to regular death. But I just think it would be fascinating, like to have lived through the last 200 years of our history would have just been extraordinary. And I would rid, wherever I was living, I would bring down the crime rate.
I love Dracula because he's powerful. Like, he shapeshifts. I think that's wonderful.
It's a persona that everybody fears, but at the same time, he doesn't care what he's doing. Especially, like, let's say the the main Dracula. He was always like, he knew what he was doing. He knew his mission. He just wanted to drink blood. He just wanted to be fearful, make sure that everybody feared him.
He's such a fascinating character. I think if you look at pop culture over time, everyone at some point in their life is influenced by Dracula or something that's Dracula-like, or certainly something that's vampire-like. So if you look back through the decades and through the generations, there's almost always a key project, whether it was the original book or a feature film or a TV series. I know when I was a little boy, I was first influenced by the 1931 Universal feature film, Bela Lugosi's Dracula. That was my moment. So I was a little kid. I remember vividly what I would do. They would let me stay up late on a Saturday night and I could watch the late night reruns. So I'm in my living room and I'm in front of my family's little black and white television, and I got to watch all the Universal black and white monster movies. But the one that made the impact for me was Dracula. That's my all-time favorite. And so Bela Lugosi's Dracula is the one film that had a huge impact on my entire life. I think everyone's got something like that, and it's often in your youth. You're fascinated by this kind of character because they're inhuman. They're almost alien, they're almost animal, but they look like a human being. There's just a natural fascination with it. So I think everyone can trace back to Bela Lugosi's Dracula, or maybe it was Hammer Films and Christopher Lee did Dracula. It could be the daytime soap opera Dark Shadows, which had Jonathan Frid as Barnabas Collins. That was also influencing me in my childhood when I was watching those reruns. And it just moves forward every decade, so it seems like each generation has got something. There was Frank Langella in 1979 as Dracula. Gary Oldman did it in the 1990s. And I think if you look over time, I mean, it influenced even the Twilight books and the Twilight movies and the Vampire Diaries on television. It's all inspired by something from the past. And I think the key project was Bela Lugosi's Dracula. It was for me, definitely.
My favorite movies about Dracula would be like the Bram Stoker Dracula. There's like animes, Castlevania, which have to do with Dracula. Those would be like one of my favorites. The book Bram Stoker is amazing. Also, like
Something about being immortal is very attractive for some reason. Yeah, I think there are some drawbacks to being immortal, but I've often thought that now that we're doing all this Mars exploration, how much I'd love to see that, and maybe even travel to Mars at some point. And I may not live to see that, but if I were immortal, I could maybe go by land on Mars, Maybe we'll populate a new planet after Mars, and I would be able to live there too. That's very exciting.
I think one of the biggest reasons I love Dracula is because he's a man in disguise, or a monster in disguise. He puts on this kind of facade of being almost vulnerable. At the beginning of the Dracula book, he is shown, or he is written as being an old, kind of decrepit man. And as the book goes on and he starts drinking the main character Jonathan's blood, he starts looking younger and younger and becomes just a younger man, and starts, we see that he's not who he said he was. He's not this old man at all, and he's not this nice man who's welcoming Jonathan into his house. He's actually this monster Dracula. He's this vampire. And I think that kind of deception behind him is what I find so interesting about Dracula.
Growing up, he was one of the original Universal movie monsters that I grew up with. You know, Bela Lugosi and the original black and white movies. That was like the staple of Dracula for me. And then from there on, just came the other adaptations. But I mean, it's always interesting when real world individuals inspire like some kind of like fantasy based stories, with Vlad the Impaler being the main source of inspiration for Bram Stoker when he wrote Dracula. So, you know, like I've always had a fascination with that. You know, like it really draws on to the fact that humanity really draws on the real world parallels and turn it into something so much bigger than they really are. Like Vlad the Impaler was like a warlord, and then he suddenly became a vampire the next day. So that's what I love about it. You know, that's what I love about Dracula, is that he is a monster of our own creation, if you will.
Well, he's pretty much inspired by Vlad Dracula. He's a gentleman, I suppose. He presents himself like as a gentleman. Yeah, he lives in a big castle in Transylvania. I don't know much about Vlad. Actually, forgotten. I know that he loved the sword, like putting people on the sword or killing people with swords, or cutting heads off, impale. Yeah.
I know he used to impale people. That's why he was a conqueror. He used to conquer like different places, and then like his enemies, he used to impale them. He used to put them on the stick from the bottom up, and used to just leave them on the stick, and then the stick would just gravity would do its thing, just take them down, and then that's how they would suffer.
Know that around the time when Vlad the Impaler was alive and he was, you know, sticking people on poles and all that stuff, I do know that there was a great war between like the Holy Roman Empire of Christianity and also the Muslim Turks. So, you know, Islam and Christianity, those two major world religions were clashing, and Transylvania was kind of like in the middle of like their battlegrounds. So Vlad the Impaler, he was a Christian, and so he was trying to basically repel the Muslims who were trying to invade his country. And it's easy to villainize a man when he does something so horrendous that, you know, even the church doesn't think of that these days. You know, like if you were to go around sticking people on a pole these days, you would be viewed as a monster as well. But Vlad, he actually did it as an intimidation tactic, you know, to show the Muslims who were invading his country that, you know, I'm not afraid of you. Like, this is what happens to you and your countrymen if you come here. You know, like, we're Christians in this country. We don't want your Muslims all around us. So I feel like Stoker chose him because, one, he was a historical figure. So when people read about it, they're going to be like, oh my goodness, was he really a vampire in real life? You know, he actually did this kind of stuff. He actually like bathed in their enemy's blood. So like the real world connection is what made Dracula, like the novel, gets so popularized, because again, like when he based it off something real that actually did happen, then it's almost like super scary to think about it. And it's not just with Dracula too. A lot of historical figures have been given kind of like a modern retelling with some kind of magical element to it. And so for that, like essentially, yeah, like I believe Stoker chose Vlad the Impaler because the monstrous deeds he performed made him the perfect candidate to become the monster that Dracula is nowadays.
Vlad the Impaler was the logical inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I don't know a tremendous amount about the history of it, but I know it is Romanian based. And Vlad was a very cruel, evil man who tortured people. So the bloodshed angle of the thousands of people who died because of him was a very likely inspiration for a creature like Dracula. So it is interesting that it does have some basis in real life history, but of course it's been turned into more of a fantasy. But yeah, in the past, centuries ago, that kind of cruelty and torture, it could happen, and so it's bizarre.
I don't remember all the exact wording, but I remember in the novel when Jonathan's writing in his journal, he describes Romania as one of the wildest frontiers of the European country. And that's true, like around Victorian England, Transylvania was, like I said, in more of a feudal state still. So there was like still mass forests all around. Like the country had been mapped, but it wasn't like a full detail map of where the roads were and everything. A lot of the roads were more of like, if you were the local, then you know how to travel. But if you were an outsider like Jonathan, you had to rely on the local civilians to like get you like, okay, like I need to get to this village, which road do I take? And then they could go up the mountain and back down, or they could go around the mountain all around. So yeah, like Victorian England, it was if you were like an Englishman born in that time period, yeah, you were probably educated to some degree, but then you went a little west past France and everything was like the other, like you said, it's kind of like, oh, these people are speaking with such strange accents, their mannerisms are so off, they're not prim and proper like how we are in England. So a lot of the countries west of Europe were viewed as the others, like I said, or like you said too.
Um, it's a classic. There's well, I began reading Bram Stoker books when I was like 7 years old. Yeah, and just the idea of this character in a cape and all these supernatural powers, and just be able to take others into another reality, which is the undead. I found that very, very interesting.
We've always watched horror films in my house, so that was never a thing like, oh, kids shouldn't watch no, like we used to watch horror films since we were little. Even if it gave us nightmares, we love horror films even up to now. So my brothers always used to be like, oh, let's put on this type of movie, Dracula, like the old Dracula, black and white. So we've always watched that maybe since I was like 6, 7 years old.
Well, one, he didn't write Dracula in a positive light per se, like he wrote Dracula, a Transylvanian man, as a monster. And then like the fact that he was this not only a monster in life, but he was also a monster because he made a deal with the devil to become like this undead being. Then they're like, we're not like that. Sorry, excuse me. We're not like that, It's kind of like you're making us look bad. You're making us look like we're monsters, like we're wild barbarians in our country. And so Stoker, like I don't know what his intentions were, maybe he just wrote a book for fun that just happened to involve a Transylvanian man, but like I can see why they would be angry, like it's kind of like when a lot of stories are written like about a certain culture in a not like a negative way, but not in a positive way either, then that culture kind of retaliates as well. Anybody who reads something about the people that they are, or the culture that they come from, or the country they came from, and it's not in a positive light where it's viewed as monsters, then they're automatically thinking, okay, well, we're not like that. Can you please stop doing that to us? Like we are a humble people. We are not like conquerors. We're not monsters. So I can understand the retaliation, how a lot of Transylvanians felt when Stoker wrote about them like that. Because again, he described their country in the book as like a wild territory, a wild region. There were still a lot of frontiers to be covered, even though it was already popularized and mapped out for the most part.
I think because a lot, like he had to choose somebody that was very powerful, like somebody that, like you said, he impelled people. So somebody that would just bring fear to his enemies. Like, I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna create fear. He used to impel people, so other places when they used to come and conquer, be like, oh, this is what he did? Wow, okay. Do we really want to mess with this guy? And I'm guessing that's the reason he got that character. It was a more fearful type of character during that time. And he just to go out there and conquer everything, he was able to.
Chose Romania, or Romanian character, possibly due to the fact that it's like, it's more anxious, more of a, to my understanding, it's more of an ancient piece of history, I suppose, and with like the heavy accent, it's like classy, you know. Dracula's classy, and yeah, classy's good, and I think it carries on the whole Romanian accent, and it's wonderful to me. I love it.
But I like your point about Bela Lugosi and his accent. You know, he was a very successful European actor, and he had a very, very thick accent. But he was successful both in Europe and in the United States. And you know, he started on stage in Dracula before he did the film version. You can argue that his accent was a tremendous asset, but it also hindered his career, because it was so thick and so memorable as that one part that this is the typecasting, the stereotyping that sometimes happens to actors. I think it did influence filmmakers tremendously. It's bizarre when you look at Bela Lugosi's history about why he didn't become a bigger asset to the studio film industry. Here we have Dracula, which was Universal's monster hit, just a huge mega hit. You would have thought that would have launched him as a huge Universal leading man. And what happened instead was they utilized him more as a supporting actor. So he was in other horror films. He played Igor in Son of Frankenstein. So he was a supporting player in studio films, but his leading roles tended to be more in the B movies. So he did White Zombie and The Corpse Vanishes and a large number of B films. So they kind of played off of the Dracula stereotype, and he got pigeonholed into that. And I think that basically followed him around through the 40s and through the 50s, and then unfortunately he passed away, you know, in the 50s, so we didn't get to see even further projects. I would have loved to have seen, if he had lasted into the 1960s, maybe television would have given him another path to go down. Because when you compare him to Boris Karloff, you know, Boris Karloff did have more opportunities. I think the studio system valued him more, and Boris Karloff did translate into television in the 50s and 60s. He's the voice of the Grinch in How the Grinch Stole Christmas. So how far removed is that from Frankenstein and the Mummy? So Boris, I think, had more opportunities than Bela, and I think one of the reasons probably is the accent. But there undoubtedly was something going on behind the scenes at Universal about why, you know, Bela did not get the full star launch that I think he should have had.
Yeah, I wanted to be a vampire one year in Halloween. Yeah, and yeah, I remember some of my earliest memories is like my father introducing me to Dracula. So that's how I became aware of Dracula. Just the whole idea of like sucking women's blood was very appealing to me, and still is appealing to me. Yeah. I want to suck your blood.
Oh, yes. Yes, I think there are some key differences between Bram Stoker's book and the 1931 feature film, but I think a lot of it is there. There's enough of a similarity so that you can find certain characters in both versions. So I think what Todd Browning did was excellent, because he kind of drew from a great source, and he tweaked it a little bit, but he tweaked it in the right manner. So, like in my mind, Renfield is such an iconic character. So Dracula and Renfield are so memorable from that 1931 feature film. I think with Bela Lugosi and Dwight Frye, those are two of the best performances that have ever been captured on film. And there's a reason for it. It's so strong and mesmerizing. And I think when people think of Dracula and Renfield, they often will go back to that. And there's no doubt that those actors influenced all the actors that followed them.
You know, I think the one of the things I find so interesting about Dracula and just kind of vampires in general is they have stayed around for so long. You know, I think the story is really interesting. You know, there's a lot of stories that kind of go in and out of fashion, but vampires have kind of been this consistent monster that's always stayed around even today in popularity. And I think it is because, you know, it's such an interesting story from a storyteller's point of view, because anyone could be turned into a vampire. So anyone could be a vampire. So there's so many stories you can tell with that. You know, like Dracula is the original version, but then you have all these other versions of, you know, all these other vampire stories that have nothing to do with Dracula. It's just, oh, here's the vampire that was turned in Mexico or turned, you know, wherever. It can be, it's kind of a universal story that could be told anywhere about vampires. And I think that's really interesting, and probably why they have this longevity. Like, same thing with zombies, is a zombie story could be told anywhere. It doesn't need to be, you know, I don't even know where zombies originated from, but it doesn't need to be in one location or one specific person. Whereas, like, you know, Frankenstein or something has to be done with a scientist turning, you know, someone back to life as a monster. Whereas Dracula, it can be anybody. Anyone could be a vampire, and I think that's why those stories have stuck around for so long.
Book. I think the Renfield character was changed somewhat, but he is in the book and he is in the film. But I like it when they pay homage to something from the past and they don't try to take it down a completely different path. I think filmmakers sometimes want to put their own stamp on things and they feel like they know better and they want it to be different. But you know what? There is a respect that you should pay to the original book and the original film. And those were such classics, and they endure for a reason. So I say, start with that, build upon it, but don't change it too much, because this is what people know and love, and there's such gold in those original characters. I love Renfield, for example. He's the everyman who becomes Dracula's slave, and he becomes the madman, the crazy man. And he's such a great, great character. I mean, every actor would want to play someone like Renfield.
There are so many, you know, everyone has their own vision when they're making films, and it's great to see everyone's different version. I enjoy it.
You have to have the sympathetic leading men and leading women, and you've got Mina and you've got Jonathan and you've got all those characters. Those are very important because people identify with them. But you do need the catalyst of some sort, and Renfield is the one who kind of comes in and sparks it up when he's there on screen. He's just such an oddball character, and it's so great that they've got him there. It's very smart from a novelist or screenwriter's perspective to have that kind of magical catalyst in a movie. It's the key to holding the viewer's interest.
Yeah.
You have to have conflict. So I'm not a writer, but my wife and I are filmmakers, and so we read a lot of scripts, and one thing that we look for is some kind of catalyst to move the story along. There has to be something interesting, some kind of conflict. It has to have a beginning, middle, and end, certainly. There has to be good character development, but there has to be a reason for every character being in that script, and you want it to be a good reason that relates to the overall movie. So you take Renfield, which in some of the versions of Dracula, Renfield's a minor character, but it's such a key character because Renfield does not become fully possessed, does not become a full vampire. He's kind of on the continuum somewhere between Dracula and a human being. So he kind of becomes Dracula's slave, as I call him. But that's interesting. It's like, why was Renfield's, the bite to Renfield different than the bite to the women? You know, it happens differently, and it's for a really good writer's reason. That's very interesting that the men are handled different from the women. And the women are presented as, I guess, vulnerable and sympathetic. I mean, you've got to realize this book was written in a different era. And nowadays, women are equal, they take charge, they're powerful. But when Bram Stoker wrote this book, it was a different world. So I think women were presented more as, the romantic love interest. And they're vulnerable, they're more likely to faint, to swoon, and to do all those things. And the men, of course, can't do that. So the men have to be stronger. And so maybe, this is a wild guess, but maybe that's why the Doctor or Renfield, they go down a different path and they don't become fully possessed by the vampirism. They're kind of halfway, they're kind of different. I'm trying to remember the Doctor. I don't know if in the book it's the Dr. Seward character. I know in the Dracula files that I did, there was a Dr. Seward who was treating Renfield at the sanitarium. And I'm trying to remember in the movie whether he gets bit or not. He might get bit later on. I can't remember if he dies or not. But I hear what you're saying. Yeah, it's like the women are presented on a much more vulnerable side, and the men are more the aggressors trying to fight him or fight off him. And of course, poor Renfield becomes the slave, so he becomes his servant. But it's different from Mina and Lucy.
As a kid, I used to always imagine myself as an assistant. What's his name? Renfield. I used to always imagine myself as Renfield. Yes, I used to eat flies when I was younger, much younger.
Yes. Well, I think from what I remember, I think in how the book and the 1931 movie are different. I think it was Harker or Renfield who was first coming to meet Dracula. I think in the book it may have been Harker, and in the movie it was definitely Renfield. So there's some key differences there. But what Todd Browning chose to do in his film was take this businessman and put him in this setting, and you see this transformation for him, and it becomes such a fascinating character. You can't wait to see what he's going to say or do next. It's just, it would be an actor's dream to do a role like that. Dwight Fry was so brilliant. I was lucky because a few years ago I was able to actually do my own version of Renfield. So my background very quickly is I started as an actor in 2012. A couple years after I had started, I'm hoping deep down that I'm going to find a project that somehow relates to something that I love from the past. So whether it be Dracula or X-Files or Twin Peaks or Lost in Space, I want to do something that somehow relates to one of my favorites. So it was around 2015 that I saw a posting for a project called The Dracula Files. I'm like, okay, this is it. This would be the one. And so I look at the listing of all the parts that they're casting, and I'm trying to get an audition because obviously no auditions are guaranteed. And I'm looking at the list, and I'm like, Dracula, I'm like, I don't think I have the look and the voice and the demeanor for that, so I don't think Dracula's right for me. And then there's Seward and Harking, and I thought, well, I can do those, but I think they're a little more vanilla. And I saw on the list Renfield. I'm like, okay, Renfield is the one that I want to go for. So I did an audition at home and sent it to them, and I made it into the in-person auditions, and I treated it like it was any theatrical film or television audition. So I prepared, I gave it my all. The Dracula Files was actually an audio drama series. So it's similar to a podcast. It's basically a scripted voiceover stage play is how I would describe it. So it's all voice work. But when I went into the audition, I decided I just wanted to create Renfield for them. So I went in as Renfield, as the character. And I kind of, I used more than my voice. I used the body language. I used everything that an actor uses. And I was thrilled that I actually got the part. So for me, that was a dream role. I mean, of all the parts that I want to play, I would say Renfield is on my very, very short list. If you ask an actor what do they want to do, they'll often say, I want to do Shakespeare. They want to do one of the classics, F. Scott Fitzgerald. And for me, no, I want to do Dracula. I want to do Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I really want to be Renfield. So I was just very, very lucky that I got to do this. And it was a fun project to be in, and they did it in 3 parts, so we shot over a period of a couple of years. But it's so fun to play this character. Renfield is in my mind, the normal guy, the everyman. That's how he starts off. And he gets brought into this odd situation with this odd character, and he has no idea what he's getting into. And he's trusting, and he's sympathetic. And Dracula, of course, takes him over, and he starts to change and evolve. So when I was doing my version of Renfield, my interpretation was that he becomes more and more like an animal. So I explained to the filmmaker, I said it's like a continuum between human and animal. And what happens to Renfield at the beginning is he starts sliding down this continuum, and he starts having animalistic desires and behaviors. And that's where everyone thinks of Renfield as the guy who eats the bugs, the guy who's crazy and screams. And it's fun for an actor to try to inhabit something like that. But it's such a bizarre character. And I think that's why, in my mind, Dracula and Renfield are the two most memorable ones from that project, is because they're unusual. You're drawn to them, and why are you drawn to them? I think Renfield has a sympathetic side because you know he's human. You see him start off as human. I think Dracula is mesmerizing because he looks human, but you don't see that he ever was human. So he looks like a human being, but he's inhuman. He's part animal. He's part alien. He's part something that's just not normal. So he becomes interesting, but for a different reason, because he was born that way. So such great characters were developed here, and I think that's why they last and they endure through the decades.
I think the Bela Lugosi's the classic version. I think that's the one everyone thinks of when they think of Dracula. That's the version your mind first goes to, with the very thick Hungarian accent and, I'm Dracula, I welcome you to my home, and that whole charade facade that he puts on. And so that's a very interesting version because it's not like he's written in the book. In the book, Dracula has an English accent. So it's very different from how he's portrayed in the book, but that through pop culture has become kind of the focus that everyone's gone to as like, oh, that is the Dracula. I think my favorite version of Dracula is from the Hammer films, the Christopher Lee Dracula, who plays him not so much as Dracula at first. He's just kind of a normal man. He's very welcoming. He's like, oh, I'll grab your bags for you. But over the course of the film, he, really starts to become this monster, and you see it in his eyes. And in the moments of like a lot of violence, like you can really see the monster behind this facade. And then the Bram Stoker version, which is probably another very popular film, popular version of Dracula. It is much more romanticized, and he is this character that you see yourself almost being. Like, you want to be that version of Dracula. Like the other versions, he's the monster, he's the villain. But in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Francis Ford Coppola version, he's kind of a hero in a way. He's the person you empathize with. He falls in love with Winona Ryder's character, and you watch this love story kind of unfold, so you kind of feel for him. Even though he's killing people and sucking people's blood, you kind of understand him a little bit more.
What's appealing to me about there's so many versions of Dracula is the fact that the idea, the concept could connect with anyone, and authors, directors, writers can also do anything with the idea as well. I mean, there's you have the Dracula that comes in human form, and then you have this other crazy version of Dracula that's this crazy looking vampire from the underworld. I think it's wonderful to have dynamics and different versions. It connects with us differently, it keeps the idea interesting.
I think it should be a scary, scary vision, not kind of a lighthearted, a wisecracking Dracula who's got one-liners here and there. That's not the Dracula I grew up with. I don't think that's how Dracula was intended. That is not Bela Lugosi's Dracula. But nowadays they make him this guy who's spewing these humorous things, and it doesn't sell to me at all.
You know, there's Bram Stoker's Dracula that
Yeah.
I think was just done brilliantly by Gary Oldman in Coppola's version. And then there's, what's his name? Bela Lugosi's version, which was kind of, well, at the time, I guess it scared people. Now it's kind of funny, you know. And then we go further, and there was Frank Langella. And I remember I went to see that because I think he's brilliant. And I was sitting, and there were two guys behind me. And when he went to bite her the first time, I guess it was Mina he bites the first time, and I just went, oh, like this, and they were going, oh God, I think she fainted, because I swooned, because it was just like, he was a very sexy vampire, a very sexy Dracula. Gary Oldman brought a lot more of the savagery, the bestiality of the creature part of Dracula, and not as much the sensualness of Dracula. Well, then we have Lestat and the vampire Lestat and all of Anne Rice's creations. And I am not that, Lestat is the brat prince, and he really isn't. And Louis kind of, it's like, lighten up, Louis. But my favorite character is Lestat's mother, Gabrielle. And I've always liked her, and I've been lucky enough to attend Anne Rice's annual Halloween party in New Orleans when she still lived down there. And at the end of the weekend, she said to me, go back to your jungle, Gabrielle. And I thought I would just die and go to heaven, because I was Gabrielle to her. And she, plus the personality, because Gabrielle has no use for civilization. She just goes off into the jungles or up mountains or whatever. She doesn't really like people. But she's living the adventure, and every once in a while she checks in on her son, and then she goes back somewhere. So, and I always liked the fact that they included her instead of all just young people. I won't even get into the Breaking Dawn, because to me that's nonsense. So it's just too young for me. You know, they're walking around glittering in the sunlight, please, you know. The whole thing about vampires is they are of the darkness, and they are very sensual creatures. So, no. Just no.
I love vampire movies. I love all the vampire movies. I don't like Twilight too much, especially because it was just more of a, he had supernatural powers, but it was not the kind of vampire that I'm used to, that I was born with. It was more of a different type of era of vampire. The reason I think there's many versions of Dracula is because everybody wants to bring something new to the table with Dracula. They want to implement something, or they want to do something else with him. They want to, they want to bring out their own story, like their own thought about Dracula, or what he might be, or how powerful he might be. So I think like every story has a connection, like based on his powers, but they also bring a different type of character of how they imagine Dracula would be in the in that time.
That's so true. I was thinking about that. Yeah, I'm going back to that Netflix one. Yeah, they just like, he was like a one-liner kind of guy in some respects, and it was contemporary humor too, and it's like, it's jarring to me. It's like, I know that things have to evolve over time and things have to be updated, but you've got to look at what worked and why it worked. So even though it's an older property and it was done in a different era, and it's not the world we live in nowadays with, you know, internet and digital and social media and all that stuff, there's something in that original concept that clicked. And so you need to draw on that, and don't change it too much. You know, pay respect to the original and stick to the original, but you can alter it, go down a different path. But there has to be something that goes back to the original, because it's so good.
I remember I did watch the Dracula Dead and loving it, but I don't remember it too much because it was kind of more of a funny kind of thing, and I was like, oh, okay, I think if it's comedy, it should be comedy. I love comedy, but once it's introduced into a horror, I'm like, okay, it's okay.
There's so many versions. I'd forgotten about the comedy version with Leslie Nielsen. I've never seen it. I mean, I take my vampires seriously, but I love Leslie Nielsen, so I might try and find that somewhere and watch it. I don't know. There'd be the viewpoint that it lessens the impact and the seriousness. And then there was comedy was it called Vampire's Kiss with Nicolas Cage, where he thought he believed he was a vampire. It was kind of actually more of a tragedy in the end, but he thought he was a real vampire, and it was, I forgot about there's probably other movies and stuff well, they did the wonderful TV series that only lasted one season, which I knew it would because it was so expensive to produce, with Jonathan Rhys Meyers, I think his name is, English actor, and he was a benevolent but gorgeous, sexy Dracula, and he invented electricity in that show, or he helped invent light bulbs. I think he didn't invent them, but he helped market the first light bulbs in England, in London. And everyone thought he was a devil for doing that. And he was constantly trying to get a drug so that he could go out in the daylight. He wanted to be out in the daylight. But it was a beautifully done series, but it cost I remember reading it cost like $50,000 an episode or something. Outrageous sum, because everything was just gorgeous. But that lasted one season. So that was nice to have it on TV and being taken seriously. And all the different versions they're all based though on the same character and the whole thing, that once you most of us accept vampires as the not common, but the everyday vampire. And to have it come from something so vile and so evil and have it evolve into something of a romantic figure, it's really fascinating. Like I said, I'm not open to the comedy. I haven't seen that. But, I mean, even back with Bela Lugosi's version, I mean, they're usually photographed so beautifully, and they bring an elegance to vampires that was missing in the original person. And they're always very elegant. They're always dressed beautifully. They always live in castles, so it's a very heroic, romantic figure. I guess that's what I like so much about it. And I'm always open to new ones. I might be a little like, but I'd read the book before they even sold the rights to Warner Brothers. And I read it when it was in galley form. And I think I said I read it in 2 nights. I couldn't put it down. And I was like telling the people where I worked with an agency, and I said, you've got to sell this for the movies. And they went, oh, vampires. No one wants to see vampires. No one cares. Well, they started caring again about vampires.
I think when Todd Browning was doing the 1931 Dracula, I think his goal was to just have something that was chilling and genuinely terrifying. So you look at Bela Lugosi and you hear his accent and you see his demeanor, and wonderful, wonderful production values. You've got to have a frame of reference that this was the early 1930s. Silent film was just ending. Talkies were just starting. But you look at what they accomplished in 1930 and 31 when this project was coming together, and they've got great direction, beautiful photography, beautiful black and white photography, incredible set design, and the wardrobes and the makeup, and you put it all together and you've actually got this film that's actually kind of scary. When I was a little boy, it certainly seemed terrifying to me, and even though I've seen the film over and over again, it still has an impact. I still get the chills when I watch it. Now, I've not watched it like 100 times or something like that, but I would say I've probably seen it at least 15 to 20 times in my lifetime. And it still chills me, and when Bela Lugosi is on screen, I can't take my eyes off of him for a second. The performance is that good. It's one of the best performances ever captured on film. He's so brilliant and so strong and so memorable that is who Dracula is in my mind. It's a permanent image. But over time, as you were saying, each decade, each new project, they kind of go down different paths. They want to put their own stamp on it. Each filmmaker they don't want to redo exactly what Todd Browning did. So they kind of change it over time. And I remember, in the 70s in particular, when they did Frank Langella as Dracula in 1979, they started going down a more leading man kind of path, a more romantic path. So they were casting someone who was more traditionally good looking, and then the women had a romantic angle. You identify with him, you like him, but he's evil and he's bad, but you're drawn to it. It's a great conflict. So I can see why they kind of go down that path. And it's interesting as the decades continue, a lot of the young adult fiction is aimed at teenage girls, and there's always that romantic angle. So it's like, it's almost saying that women are kind of drawn to it, even though it's something they shouldn't be drawn to. I think that's the whole basis of the Twilight films. And when you look at the films, you've got Robert Pattinson, who's very good looking. So it's a kind of a conflict. It's like the women are interested in him, but they should stay away from him. So it creates this great catalyst for making an interesting movie.
I am an avid reader, and I have a vivid imagination. So I prefer the novel personally, but it's fun to escape in a film. It's fun to watch and enjoy a film every now and then.
Which version? I think it would have to be the Bram Stoker's Dracula. I think that's one of the first ones that it comes to memory that I watched. Like when he was in the castle, old and everything. That was the first one that I think I remember.
I think Bela Lugosi as Dracula influenced so many people, and I think it's because there's certainly the Bram Stoker book, but that didn't have as wide an audience as film does. So when Universal released Dracula in 1931, it was a huge hit, and it launched a whole series of horror films for them, and it really put Universal on the map. So I think back then, you didn't have a lot of choices. It was pre-internet, pre-digital, pre-television even. So the feature film ended up lasting and having longevity. So it was reissued to theaters over and over. So it played through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But when TV launched and the TV syndication packages started, then it reached an even bigger audience. And then it got to influence young people like me. So I think that's when I see a lot of Dracula projects coming out of it. And it seems like in recent years, there's something every couple of years that just launches. I mean, there was just a Dracula on Netflix a little over a year ago, for example. So it's a property that it keeps going and going and going. And I think it's because people are fascinated by that character. There's just something unusual and mesmerizing. It's an interesting character to analyze because very selfish, very narcissistic, very controlling. But depending on the actor doing the role, it can go down a different path. And it can be, sometimes romantic. It's just very interesting that you can play it different ways. But I think it's all inspired by Bela Lugosi's Dracula. I think for people of a certain age, the older you are, certainly this is true, when you think of Dracula, Bela Lugosi pops into your mind. They're synonymous. They're inseparable. Bela Lugosi is Dracula. So I think that's why the imagery and sort of pop culture merchandising, it almost always relates back to Bela Lugosi's Dracula.
I think it was back when we still had to rent movies on VHS. I remember we used to rent like the Frankenstein movies, the Wolfman, and we rented like the whole trilogy kind of thing, and we used to watch it on the weekend. That was like our thing to do.
Well, when I was a teenager, I saw Martin Landau in a stage live version of Dracula, which they tried to be as close to the original book as they could, and it hooked me. I was like, wow, this guy can turn into a bat, and they had the bat fly out over the audience, and it just seemed so realistic, and I really enjoyed that. I love the original story, Bram Stoker. I love the 1990s film that you mentioned. That soundtrack, I still listen to it to this day. That was really well done, very eerie. I thought it gave a lot of good nuance about the Dracula story. There's a film that came out recently called Nosferatu with Doug Jones, an actor named Doug Jones. I really enjoyed that. It was very creepy, and not everything about Dracula is creepy, but as we get closer to Halloween, that's everybody thinks about Dracula.
And Lestat, in the first book, which is Interview with the Vampire, his mother, he's turned into a vampire while he's out hunting in the forest, as I recall. And his mother gets very ill, or something happens that she's dying. And he transforms her into a vampire so she won't die. And she, as I recall, she's tall and she's blonde and she's very strong-spirited, and it worked for her very well because the husband, the father, was very imposing. So she could just go off and do whatever she wanted to do, which back in that time period, 1700s maybe was when, I'm not sure, but she could just live her life any way she saw fit, which women back then could not do. So, and Lestat is fascinating because he's young and very virile, and she imagined a combination of Robert Plant, the former lead singer of Led Zeppelin, and the actor Rutger Hauer, who recently passed away. Just big, blonde, sexy, sassy, and answered to no one. He just was, and thought he was a rock star. Then we have the other Queen of the Damned that was done with Stuart Townsend playing Lestat, and he was wonderful. He was who I would have preferred to see do Interview with the Vampire instead of the person they cast, because that was a travesty.
Yeah, like I think with Interview with a Vampire, like I think that's when, with Interview with a Vampire, that's where vampires flipped from being the monsters to being the protagonist. They cast Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise as the main vampires. So they're, good-looking guys who are, you're not afraid of these people. You're like, oh, I'm attracted to these people, or I want to be these people. And I think because of that, it's made this flip from, with all vampire movies nowadays, vampires are seen as the heroes and not really the bad guys. You had that TV show True Blood or Twilight, which was all like about romantic vampires, and the vampires are the protagonists rather than the villain. So I think that flip has made them from not really being the monsters so much anymore, but the people you can see yourself as, or the superheroes even. Like you have the Underworld movies, and she's the badass vampire who's killing werewolves, and so it's not really as scary anymore. It's a cool version, but you're not afraid of the vampires anymore, like the old school Dracula films.
Interview with a Vampire? Yes, I remember. That's an awesome movie. I love that movie. How the little girl stayed young forever, and she loved Tom Cruise throughout history. Yeah, I remember that movie. It was amazing.
But then when they cast Queen of the Damned, they chose with her approval. She liked Stuart Townsend and she wanted him as Lestat, and they let him have him as Lestat, and he was real good. He was playing. He goes through a rock star phase where Lestat actually is a rock star, and Stuart Townsend played it so well. He was my favorite of her vampire Lestat's favorite actor so far. I don't know if they're going to do any of the other books, but and overall I'd say Frank Langella, just because I was such a fan of his, and he was so elegant and so graceful and so sexy, anyone want to be bitten by him. He's just, and it's interesting because all of these, and I talk about all the sensual part, but they're based on a real person who was the complete opposite and was just an animal. Impaling his friends, impaling people on stakes while they ate their dinner. I mean, he was a total just psycho, horrible person. But somehow Bram Stoker took that and turned it into a more heroic romantic figure. And I always thought it was very funny because, he was called that Vlad the Impaler because he did that. And the way to kill a vampire in Bram Stoker's book is to use a wooden stake. And I thought, he took that and turned it around and still has it killing people, but it kills vampires as well. And the fact that you can't see them in a mirror, and the fact they can just turn into a bat or a wolf and get out of there. All that's just fascinating to me.
I wouldn't say Dracula would be scary per se. He might be fearful, especially when he wants to eat, but like he's more of a like I would think like okay, like more of a mellow person, and like be like okay. And when he wants to seduce a woman, I think he would be more passionate towards a woman, like that way he gets their attention and be like, oh, I want to go with this guy. And then when he brings them like to his house or anything, it would be more fearful because he's gonna do whatever he's gonna do. I think I wouldn't know who to portray for those type of, because they played amazing vampires. I think the reason they played it like especially sexy would be because they wanted to introduce the type of vampire that wanted to captivate women, and that women were like, oh, we love vampires. We love this type of vampire. We would go with this type of vampire, and then be like, oh, but what does he do? He kills them. Like, or like the little girl, he saved her, and that's the reason she loved him. But it was more of a like that's the only reason I would think they portrayed a sexy kind of vibe, so women could fall in love with those type of actors or vampires. For him, it's because he played an amazing vampire that I wouldn't even know who to cast. Like I would have to check on the acting skills, but he played it so well that I couldn't even imagine somebody else playing that.
I think it's good. I don't think Brad Pitt. I don't think Tom Cruise. They did that whole interview with the vampire thing. I don't think that's not what I'm picturing.
You know who I'd love to see play Dracula would be Forrest Whitaker. I met him once, and I think he can play a really evil, mean character. But he's also got a certain soft side to him, and I think that would play well for Dracula. Someone else I think might do a good job would be John C. Reilly. I don't know if you know who that is, but he is a very talented actor as well. And of course, I mentioned him earlier, Doug Jones. Doug Jones would be a great Dracula. He's a very physical actor, and I think he could show a lot of respect for Dracula.
Yes, I think David Tennant would be an interesting choice. He's done Doctor Who in a lot of projects, and he's an interesting actor. I think he would have an interesting take because he's got a completely different demeanor from someone like Bela Lugosi. But he's such a versatile, interesting actor that there's a lot of people like that, like Daniel Day-Lewis. Or I'd love to see what would they do with this character. I wouldn't go down the route of just your typical good-looking leading man. I think you've got to have someone who certainly has looks and charisma, very important to this character, but they've got to be an interesting actor for other reasons. So I wouldn't sell it 100% based on the look. And sometimes Hollywood will do that. They'll go with whoever's hot at the moment. But I think there's some other actors, like if you can picture Andy Garcia, like that's an interesting look, and we know he's an interesting actor, and he would have made an interesting Dracula, certainly at one point in time, and maybe even still now. So I would say Hollywood should dig beyond their current A-list, dig deeper than whoever's connected with the best agency right now. Don't go with necessarily who's hottest. Go with the right actor, and maybe that's why they'd have to kind of do it more as an independent movie than a studio movie.
If I had to cast somebody famous to be Dracula, I think I would do one famous actor would actually have to be Tom Brady. I like him as an actor. I think he could change his characters. I've seen him like do different characters, and I think he would play a pretty good Dracula. Like just his character alone, he picks up some, like he has that self-esteem. Like, oh yeah, I'm this type of person, and I think that's how Dracula should be. Like, yeah, all stuck up and be like, yeah, I can take on anything I want.
I mean, I think even I think Leonardo DiCaprio would put an interesting spin on it as well. I think he's proven that he's such a versatile actor, and he's mesmerizing in everything that he does, and he's got such a wide range. and he's middle-aged. He's kind of the right category for it, and with some interesting hair, makeup, and wardrobe, I think Leonardo DiCaprio would make an interesting Dracula. I'd love to see what he could do with it. So it would be a fun thing to see if they were to revive it, like as a Broadway play as well. I mean, they tend to redo Dracula every few years, and they'll often, they sometimes will put a more unknown actor, or they'll put a British actor, someone that American audiences are less familiar with. So they tend to either go towards the big name American star, or they kind of go with an interesting European actor or British actor that the American audiences are less familiar with. So sometimes they're kind of selling Dracula as a character, and sometimes they're selling him as, Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, with the Interview with a Vampire. So they're kind of selling those guys, and they're putting them in a vampire movie. Whereas you could put an unknown in, and you've got no frame of reference, and it's like, maybe it's easier to buy the fantasy sometimes when it's an unknown actor that you don't have a preconceived notion of, perhaps.
I think the person I'd like to cast as Dracula would be Tom Hardy. Because when we usually think of Dracula, he's depicted as a very tall, kind of lanky, skinny man. And Tom Hardy's much shorter, broad shoulders, a little more stocky. And I think that's such a flip from what we think of Dracula as looking like or sounding like or being like. And Tom Hardy would just play a much different version of Dracula, maybe more intimidating. And I think nowadays we've kind of lost that version of Dracula, the intimidating Dracula. He's become more of almost a cartoon character in a way. And I think I would want to see him be scary again, and I think Tom Hardy could do a really good job at making him scary again.
I think if they were to cast Johnny Depp as Dracula and they made it a serious drama, I think that would be something very interesting. I think Johnny Depp has got the versatility, and he's an interesting actor, and I think he could put his own unique stamp on it. But I would not want them to go down the path of making it a comedy. When Johnny Depp worked with Tim Burton on the updated Dark Shadows, they played that as a comedy. They played it as humor. So Johnny Depp's Barnabas Collins was very different from Jonathan Frydd's Barnabas Collins. So I think a lot of the purists, the original fans of Dark Shadows, they kind of rejected that film for that reason because it was so different. Now, to Tim Burton's credit, they were trying to get a new audience, a young audience. There was a reason for it. But I would go back to the original book and the original film, and I would play it dead serious, very scary. I would love to see a filmmaker like John Carpenter tackle it. I think there's a lot of great, talented people that could put their own stamp on Dracula, and I'd love to see, what Johnny Depp would do with it.
Okay. Who would I cast in the Dracula movie today? Myself. Seriously.
With, drinking the blood of Christ and that whole thing, it's kind of like, oh, you're on this pure way of thinking. You're like, one day you're living your life good, and then one day you'll die and go to heaven. Whereas vampires are all about prolonging their life as long as possible. So they want to live forever. And I think there's kind of that clash of ideas where it's like, oh, one day, if you'll live a natural life, and then one day you'll die, and then you'll go to heaven. Whereas vampires are like, okay, I want to live as long as possible, but if they ever do die, they'll go to hell. So that's one thing I could think of, is just like the idea of, choosing a better path or choosing the righteous path could lead you to heaven, whereas choosing this path where it's like the easy choice at first might seem, oh, I want to be a vampire, I get to live forever, I get to have my good looks forever, but then, one day you might be killed and then go to hell, and like that will be your forever. So I maybe that might be kind of the idea behind it, is like the easy choice isn't always the best choice. Or it might seem like the best way to live is being a vampire, but really you're cursed. So that might be one way to think of it.
I think vampires just came from like a folklore. Like people thought like zombies, oh, he's gonna come back. And then they were like emphasized on that, like, oh, he's gonna come back and he's gonna instead of eating the person's brains or whatever, it would be like, oh, he's gonna eat your blood, and then he's gonna take all your blood, and you're gonna be dead, or you're gonna turn into one of them. So it kind of was like based off, I'm thinking based off like zombies, and then it introduced to vampires, and it kind of mixes into that whole plot of like undead.
I think the idea behind vampires, or in the folklore, I think is to kind of, you know, represent like the devil, I would assume, and kind of like anything to do with blood and like that is kind of demonic or anything like that. So and like, you know, in his book, and I don't know if this was in folklore or not, it's all like the way to kill a vampire is, you know, through Christ and with a crucifix and a wooden stake to the heart. So I think if anything, the tale is almost about like, at least in Bram Stoker's version, about like, oh, if you are, you know, religious and you're with people and you can fight any evil, you can fight any devil. I don't know if it has that meaning nowadays anymore. I think vampires have become their own separate thing, but I think originally it was kind of, you know, this demon or something that would, you know, you were worried about, or like Christ will save you in that kind of way. Yeah, that's what I think.
The reason he brought like the blood sucking to Vlad, I'm the only reason I'm thinking he brought it together was because like blood supposedly in folklore makes you stronger, brings out a different type of creature from a person if you drink too much blood, because the blood helps you, makes you something else. So I'm guessing he was like, how can I make this type of character more powerful? Like, or how, just bring a twist into it. Like, how would he be able to impel that many people or conquer this many lands by himself, or with a small group of people? Oh, let's bring the blood into this, like make him more powerful than what he already is. He used to drink blood, so he used to be more powerful, and that way he was able to conquer more land.
Well, actually, my favorite variation of an actor for Dracula so far has been Gary Oldman. I don't know if you saw the 1992 version with Keanu Reeves and Winona Ryder, but he played Dracula in that one, and he was such a beautiful man, you know, as like the monster, he was perfect. His accent was on point, and then when he like put on like the younger form of himself with like the long hair tresses and like the Victorian outfits, he was such a beautiful man. I could see why he easily was able to seduce like the character of Mina and everything, with his charm and his wit and everything. If I had to like make a movie, I would probably cast him as well, because, you know, he's played the role once before, so we know he's capable of doing it. But more than that, and, you know, like, it could be like, okay, well, you did this in this version. How about you do a little bit more of a creepy look in this one? You know, like seduce with your eyes, if you will, and use less words. So Gary Oldman, I would probably have to say. But for me, like, I've always viewed vampires as more of a ravenous beast, but not so much to the point where it's kind of like they're mindless individuals like zombies. If anything, it's probably more like a modern day bat, if you will. You know, the modern day vampire bats, we don't think of as monsters because they're just animals, you know? And yeah, they operate at different times of the day. They're nocturnal. For me, that's always been what vampires are too. It's kind of more like a nocturnal subspecies of humanoids, whether it be like through an infection that they become this like monster, or an evolutionary branch off into like somewhere in the distant past. So it's always been like, I've always believed in that kind of stuff. You know, like maybe like back then people didn't understand illnesses, and then they made it into a whole myth, or maybe, like I said, there's some unknown species out there that are actually feeding off blood that we just don't know about.
I mean, everyone has their own interpretation, I think. And if you can dwell just on the fact that they kill people and take their blood, and yeah, that's awful, but that's what they are. They're vampires. They have no other way. They can eat animals. They can kill animals and live on small animals a lot of the time. But I read. But that everyone has their own interpretation of vampirism and that life, and that that's why I don't think it'll ever go away, because it's just everyone can take away something different from it. And not all bad. They don't have to take all negative away. If they do, that's their right. But you can take all sorts of different things. I mean, a vampire that, if I had been born around the Civil War, say, or born, meaning born as a vampire, and I'd lived till now, think of all the changes and all the things you would have seen in the last 200 years. I mean, it would just, you would have been there for them. That would be my kind of vampire I'd be, and I'd only kill bad people. That's so.
Vampires have existed before Bram Stoker's novelization of Dracula, but so for me, I study mythology for a hobby, so it's always interesting to see like the original like sources and everything. And vampires before Dracula were thought of as what we would probably associate more with zombies these days. You know, the living undead, mindless, always wanting to feed and everything. And you know, like back then, superstition was on the high, especially with like major world religions like Christianity, Islam. They were on the rise as well. So with those mythologies that were always kind of like witchcraft this, witchcraft that, then like seeing that kind of stuff, like Bram Stoker, he's probably more like, okay, so we believe garlic repels vampires, so I'm gonna add garlic in my story, which he does. Like in his book, Lucy, one of the characters who's like being fed on by Dracula, he puts like he adds that Dr. Van Helsing puts garlic all around Lucy to repel vampires, and this works in the books, but then at the same time, it's kind of like real world myths, like I said, like he draws on our natural fear of the unknown, because around the time when the book came out, it's kind of like, I wouldn't say that people were super religious still, it wasn't like 15th century like mass hysteria anymore, but it's still kind of like that gothic horror feel, like the fear of the unknown and everything. And they lived in a scientific world by then with modern Victorian England, but it's still kind of like there's still frontiers, like there's still lesser developed countries like Transylvania, which is more kind of like in a feudal medieval state, if you will. So with that interpretation, I'd say like, yeah, he basically draws on our fears, if you will. Like for us, we think it's silly nowadays, but then yeah, like for people back then, it's like, oh my goodness, like we also believe this kind of stuff, this is real. And the fact that he wrote about this is like like a breakout, if you will. So that's essentially how I would view his interpretation. He plays more on our fears.
I've heard about energy vampires. Like I've read upon it. Like people who are able to touch people and like they feel weaker. The other person feels weaker, and that person supposedly feels a lot more power, or they're able to produce different types of energy.
Oh yes, well, I've heard of energy vampires, and I've met some people like that just wear you out because they take all your energy, and they tend to be, usually the ones I've met are negative people. They're negative by nature, and they take all your nice energy away from you. And if I'm in a situation and I sense that there is someone like that, I will avoid them, because they, of course, I can sense them, they could sense someone. I also think I've gotten stronger that I would like, no, you can't take my energy. But I've heard about it. So that, in that aspect, or psychological vampires that want to control you, yes, there have always been and always will be people like that. They're very, to me, that's just, I would avoid that situation. I don't know if I would turn into a negative, more of a negative natured person if I was a vampire, just due to the fact that I was living so long, whether I'd get just kind of fed up with being alive. I'm sure you go through periods of thinking, I don't want to live forever anymore, but as far as energy vampires, oh yeah, we've all met those people, or the people that are just so negative that you just, they put off so much negative energy, you just don't want to be around them. I recently was with a group of people, and there was this guy there that I thought, this guy I'm going to see in the news for killing someone someday. I mean, he had such negative energy coming out of him. And he was this huge, tall guy, but I just felt nothing but negativity. And it wasn't that he smiled the whole thing, had conversation, but there was just something about him, and I just didn't want to be around him. So to me, that's a negative vampire. I mean, it's not, I guess no one, I'm the only one who would think there's a benevolent vampire, but I mean, I do. I think there's good vampires, but yeah, vampire energy, so much so that's why you're supposed to unplug the appliances you're not using, because the power company is making money if you aren't using, say, your radio or stereo, and you leave it plugged in. They're still making money off it because it's plugged in, and that's vampire energy. And they're stealing from you, like they steal life from you, supposedly, and steal your blood. So it's interesting it's come to a term like that to describe electricity, but electricity's energy, so.
The reason they use blood would be because it's like the energy, the source of a person. If you don't have blood, you don't have anything. It's like, I'm guessing they took it off from like the blood of Christ, kind of. Like, oh, the blood of Christ, the blood of man. So it would be like the DNA has to do with everything. It gives you supernatural powers, I'm thinking.
Yeah, and they could help influence history, influence politics, and they can be evil. There's lots of evil vampires, but that's supposedly the traditional. But it's just they have to feed on human blood. That's why they're considered evil. Because he's such a romantic. I mean, he falls in love, but I think the power they have, because they are such powerful beings, that if they could use that for good, it would really help change the world for the better.
Yeah, like Stoker always, I wouldn't say he intentionally poked fun, but he did raise a lot of viewpoints for his novel as well, for Dracula. You know, like you have like the monster that the protagonists are trying to fight against, but then at the same time, the more you read into the book, the more you realize, are we the monsters in this situation, or is he the monster? He feeds on the blood of the living, but we're doing everything inhumanly possible to try to kill him. So it brings down to the fact, you know, like it's kind of like one of those scale measurements, you know, like who is the monster in the situation? Who is the more superior culture? Are they really the other, or do we just have a different viewpoint of how life should be?
One thing that comes to mind on how I would change the story would be, it'd be dope if he would be like an awesome teleporter. Like he could teleport like more, you know, like more throughout, I suppose. Yeah, that's pretty much how that comes to mind right now. I think Bram Stoker did a very, very wonderful job with his ideas. Like it's very, very artsy. It's very art. It's very ancient. It's art, and it's just genius.
I think Dracula could be improved in today's world with a new project if they focused on production design in particular. You want the movie to be scary. I would say don't just rely on what look like artificial special effects and artificial CGI. The tendency is to go down that path, and it's become an easy path for the studios to go down, certainly. But I say, have your production design dig deeper. There's nothing creepier than something that looks truly real and scary. And I think with Dracula and the castle and the sets and the fog, there's so much that you can do that kind of pays homage to the great black and white films of the past. You look at the film noir category, and why were those films effective? They were actually done on relatively low budgets, but it was the black and white cinematography, and it was, you know, the gray clouds and the fogs, and it had such atmosphere. So I would say, you know, focus on the scary parts, but do it with believable, you know, sets and believable design, and so that people will fall into that world and they'll think, what would it be like to really be there? I think we get desensitized when we watch some movies because it doesn't look real anymore. I mean, sometimes you can tell that the actors aren't on an actual set or an actual building, that it's all been created around them. It's the whole green screen concept, right? And audiences just, you know, they don't really think. It doesn't make them think. They just kind of sit there and eat their popcorn and absorb it. They don't have to really think too deep about it. I think this is, you know, kind of what reality television is all about. You just sit there and watch, and it's not complicated, and you just, you know, either you like the people and like the situation or you don't, and you just kind of buy what they're feeding you. But I think you should actually do a project where you have to think a little bit more. And so I think the more real it is, the more you're going to buy it. And that's the psychological terror aspect. That's what I like, is a psychological horror film, a psychological thriller. Those are the truly scary films in my mind.
So they do have a type of character that they're not trying to recreate Dracula altogether. They're just trying to implement on what already is Dracula, on the folklore that already is Dracula. So they bring the Dracula that they think it's more common and be like, what can we implement so we can make it more of our own little taste?
Yeah. Let me think about, like, what else should I ask you? What is your favorite thing? Is it like audiobooks, or is it the movie? Is it the play?
My favorite would be the movies. The audiobook it's okay, but just watching it and actually visualizing how it is, it's a little bit better for me. It's like, oh wow, this is what he's doing. Okay. Like the audiobook, I understand that you could use your imagination to know whatever you want to think about, like during that moment in the timeline that they're reading. But in the movie, you're like, oh wow, this is what he's doing. This is what's going on. It's more visual.
Yeah, you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're right. Is there anything you want to add?
No.
Yeah, you answered all my questions. I think that's it.
Okay.
Well, I think the whole thing about him having to sleep in a coffin is creepy. It's a little claustrophobic for me. But there's nothing I don't like about Dracula. I think it's a great story. I love that story, you know. How he's able to shapeshift, and how he's such an imposing figure, and the lore and the history is so attractive because here in the United States, people see Dracula and vampires as something that comes around during Halloween, and that's really it. But if one travels throughout the United Kingdom, very specific parts of the United Kingdom, they take this lore very seriously. And because, you know, Vlad the Impaler was a real person, and his story is fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating because what they tell us is somewhat different than what actually happened. They don't tell us that he was just a guy trying to survive, and they sieged his palace because they wanted his land or whatever it was they wanted from him, and you know, he was just trying to get by. So it's a great story. It's a great story.
Thanks for mentioning Vlad, because I forgot to ask you about him. I like ran out of questions.
It's all good.
What,
I think
like,
it turned out a lot better than yesterday.
yeah, like more natural. You sounded very natural. What
I love old horror movies that use just the very simple thunder and lightning aspect. I think it's very, very effective, and it doesn't get used today as much as it used to. And I don't know why that is. Maybe they feel it's old hat, or with CGI you can do so many other things instead. But when I was growing up, and it didn't matter whether it was a big budget film or a low budget film, it mattered to me whether it was scary and spooky or not. And there are certain things that just are. The old dark house, the old dark castle, the lightning, the thunder. I mean, that's still effective to this very day. And I think if you've got a great location, an actual location that you can find, and you can add those elements, it would still be new and interesting. It wouldn't be the same old as long as you were in, maybe a real castle in Europe. Shoot your film there, and then add some of the special effects and the cobwebs and all the fun things like that. I think there's a lot there. Nowadays, of course, filmmakers have to do everything quick and dirty and cheap. So it's very frustrating, and so they end up doing, I guess, more of the green screen stuff. And I guess in some respects it's easier for them to just kind of CGI things in as opposed to sending a film crew over to Europe. Those are kind of the good old days when the studios used to spend more money on that type of stuff. I mean, they still do for certain properties, but they'll often do it in a country where there's, I guess, some kind of tax benefit. There's a reason Mission Impossible is shooting in Australia or wherever it is. I mean, as opposed to Los Angeles, or as opposed to, a city in Germany or a city in Italy. It becomes very, very expensive, and everyone's watching the dollar, got to answer to the stockholders. And so it's a shame, because when you look back at not necessarily really old movies, but like I'm very partial to the movies of the 1970s. I think that's a wonderful era of filmmaking. And back then the studios did a lot of local location shooting. So they did send film crews here and there, and some of those films were just so memorable for that reason. Sometimes it's as simple as just having a film crew go to New York City. They left Los Angeles and went to New York City, and they did those gritty, Robert De Niro type films like Taxi Driver. It's so effective that that's set in New York City. So sometimes it's worth the money to go to New York City or Europe or South America or wherever and have a real authentic location. I wish that we could do more of that, but money's tighter nowadays than it used to be. The audiences are fragmented and they're smaller. When I was a kid, there were 3 or 4 or 5 channels on television, and that was kind of your choice. Now we have the internet and social media, and so there's so many platforms. I was thinking about this recently. Someone asked me, it's like, there should be so many more jobs for actors nowadays than there used to be, and it's like, well, I don't really see that, and why is that? It's because everything has to be shot quick, dirty, and cheap. So yeah, there's a lot of channels and platforms and streaming sites, and there's all of those things, but everything's got to be done, like I say, quick and dirty, and it's such a shame because you lose something there. I think there's a quality element that just gets lost in the translation because the money's so low. It's unfortunate.
Well, in a new movie, Dracula would have to have social media. He'd have to have his own social media page. Can you imagine how many millions of followers he might have?
I think in some respects we're training our young people to have very short attention spans. I mean, kids always have short attention spans, right? But listen, when I was a kid, I could sit through a half-hour sitcom after school. I could sit through Gilligan's Island or something and be fully entertained. But I think with social media and Snapchat and TikTok and all these things, I mean, we keep, making it shorter and quicker. So it's like you can watch something on your device while you're walking. 10, 20 years ago, maybe it was more like, when you were commuting on a train or a bus and you could watch some short form entertainment. But when it became kids having a mobile device in their hands, then we had to make it even shorter. And there was Vine for a while. There are all these really short content videos out there. And so people get used to that. And it's so disposable. And I get that it's fast and easy. I get it. I totally get it. We can all go to YouTube and watch anything. You can watch something long, like a movie. You can find, a movie that maybe hopefully is in the public domain, hopefully, on YouTube. Or you can watch a short film, or you can watch a 10-second video. I mean, there's all sorts of things out there. So kids have been trained for it. And I don't know. If parents are watching this, I would say, make sure your kids get to see a wide variety of things. Expose them to different things. Expose them to classic things from the past. And those are the good old days when there was episodic television, scripted episodic television, imagine. And, there's a lot of great shows and great movies. And go back through the decades. Introduce them to the black and white films. Introduce them to the silence. Expose them to everything, because if they've got a mind that will absorb these things, you'd be surprised. They'll find some of it interesting. Not all of it. I'm sure that's true. But some of it, there may be a little boy or a little girl out there who could see the 1931 Dracula for the first time and go, wow, there's something magical about this movie. It's sort of like you have to analyze, like, why do the Christmas animated specials still run to this very day? So why is the Charlie Brown Christmas and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, why do these still run on prime time on the major networks to this day? You would think kids wouldn't want to see that old type of animation because they could go to the theater and see, the newer films. But no, there's something about those projects. They had such quality and they were done so well that a little kid watching Frosty the Snowman for the first time, it was made in the 60s or 70s, they're still drawn to it. And that's because it's good quality. So don't just stick to TikTok and stuff like that. Dig deeper, please.
It's a fascinating subject. It's just a fascinating subject, that's all. It's just one that I've liked since I was very young, and I just never tire of it. And just when it's being forgotten, the last version of a vampire, they come up with a new version. So I think now if they could do either a black woman or a black man and a woman of some diverse, though, not just white people. We've been in charge long enough. It's time to let other people be seen. I think that would just be really cool. I'd look forward to that.
If I were to update or improve the story of Dracula and rewrite it in my image, I would probably explore a little bit more of the origins of Dracula, because in the books it says that and like in many variations so far, he made a deal with the devil and everything. And so I just want to know, like, nobody makes a deal with the devil just for any, like, just be like, I wake up one day, I'm gonna make a deal with the devil today, kind of deal. So like, I would probably want to see his motivations as to why. And there have been a lot of like reinterpretations as to why he made it, but I want like my own reason, like maybe he lost like his son, that if the devil like maybe the devil has like this like little game, like, if you can kill all my enemies of Christ, I will bring your son back to life. Humanize him a little bit more, because like behind every man there's a monster, and behind every monster there's a man to be involved. So give him proper motivation. And like the whole love story, that is a motivation in the novel, but then I feel like you need a proper motivation. Like you fall in love with someone, that's okay. That could be a motivation. But then, like, you need a real reason. A reason to actually do something on a grand scale, like make a deal with the devil. Like, yeah, like, did he lose his child who was the apple of his eye, or did he lose something, or like, did he want something that like he couldn't get as a regular man, if you will? So if I were to reinterpret Dracula in my own ways, then yeah, I will give him more motivation and more focal point on that, so that way audiences could better understand why it is that Dracula is the way he is. Like, why does he need the blood? Maybe he's collecting the blood for the devil as tribute, for like, or as a thank you gift, because the devil's like, this man is like, he like vexed me. He's sinful. Go and get his blood and bring it to me as a gift. So Dracula goes, drinks his blood, and brings it back to the devil as a gift or something. So maybe that's where the origins of the myth can come true. You know, like he does take the blood, but like we don't know that he's drinking it. We just know that he's taking the blood. He's bringing it back to the devil, if you will.
If Dracula decided to visit Los Angeles right now, in the present day, I would imagine he'd be very urban, very street, and as I said earlier, I think he'd be doing a lot to bring down the crime rate. I can't think about it, but, well, there was Blackula too. I'm thinking a street, like a black Dracula. He was a rapper instead of a rock star, and somebody who's trying to bring equality for everybody, including vampires.
The way I would update it for today's world would be not him living in a castle by himself and just eating blood, more of a, like him trying to be an eternal person, trying to communicate with the world and trying to understand it, but at the same time trying to get people, because he's gonna have to drink blood. So take people from like his little course and people they wouldn't miss, so and then just vanishing them and or turning them into a type of vampire, and then them bringing him the next type of food, like, or the next person, so he doesn't have to go out there too much and put himself out there, so people don't suspect like, oh, he might be a vampire.
Oh, the other thing they should do, the other thing is the last thought they should do, they've done the serious play. I would love to see a Dracula musical, a Broadway musical, like Phantom of the Opera kind of, just a very grand romantic musical with Dracula singing. I just think that would be fun. I love Broadway musicals and I love Phantom of the Opera, but I just think that would be, they haven't done that yet as far as I know. Now that Broadway's coming back and theater's coming back, and oh, thank goodness. That would be something really I don't know if Andrew Lloyd Webber is still doing musicals, but something that would be worthy of Dracula, because he's such a brilliant composer. But I would love to go see a Dracula musical with him singing. I guess Phantom of the Opera is about as close as I'm going to get to that. But I saw that 6 times, so I just love that. But that would be nice to have a Broadway musical. I would like that.
So I think filmmakers nowadays, they've tried to change and adapt, and with superhero movies and Marvel comic movies being so big, that this of course has influenced recent Draculas as well. So Van Helsing has become kind of this key character, and he's kind of the fighter, the action hero now. That probably wasn't the original intent. You know, if you go back to the original book and the old movies, Van Helsing, wasn't this young, brawny guy like a Hugh Jackman. He was, an older gentleman, and he was, fighting the fight against Dracula his way, which involved his intellect and not just his muscle. But Hollywood feels like we have to have the action movies and the action heroes. So nowadays, Van Helsing is typically a man or a woman, and they're, kicking and fighting and, being very aggressive in their battle against Dracula. So there's almost like in every Marvel movie, there's a fight to the finish between Van Helsing and Dracula. And I think it's, in my mind, personally, I think it's becoming kind of a cliche that we kind of expect that. So in a recent Dracula project, there was a woman version, a female version of Van Helsing. I think she was a relative of perhaps the original Van Helsing. It was a contemporary set piece, and so now you've got the women flying through the air and kicking and punching, and it becomes about bloodshed and CGI and special effects, and of course none of this was thought of when the book was written, or when Bela Lugosi did his movie, or even when Christopher Lee did his movie. It's something that's changed in the last couple of decades, and it takes it down a different path, and I think that's a shame. That's just my personal opinion, because I think it changes the focus so that we kind of become desensitized, and we expect all this great CGI where people are jumping across buildings, and it doesn't really fascinate us anymore. We kind of expect it, so it's sort of like, oh yeah, there goes Van Helsing up the wall and flipping over, and there goes Dracula flying through the air. That's the way, big budget summer movies are nowadays. But that's not how it was originally written. You had to scare people another way. You had to do it psychologically. There was more a psychological terror in the book and those old movies. And that's what I like. It makes your mind think. And that, in my mind, is what's scary. When you look at, why do we have dreams and what connects to it? It's all psychological, intellectual stuff about what sticks in our heads and what doesn't stick in our heads. And in my mind, I'm not afraid of that CGI stuff that I see on the big screen. I'm afraid of something that's more conceptual, something that I can't control, something that is truly scary. And that is the original Dracula.
I saw on the news the other night, a couple weeks ago actually, that for the people in Romania, they're opening up Vlad's, Dracula's castle. So you can go in and get your COVID shot and you get a free tour of the castle. So I was like, oh, I want to go. I already had mine, but it just was to be sitting in Vlad's castle and get your vaccine would just be very cool. So it's, he's everywhere.
I actually had a pet raccoon named him Dracula because he's nocturnal. True story. Yeah.
Somebody very clever thought that up and said, get your vac from Drac. Vac from Drac. And I thought that would have been fun. I got mine at Dodger Stadium here in Los Angeles, so it wasn't as exciting.